So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Nichols. David is an Associate Professor at Melbourne University's Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. That's off the bio, so I hope it's all up to date. He teaches in urban planning history, theory and social and cultural planning, and has published works in 20th century Australian planning and urban history, as well as on cultural, socio-historical and heritage issues. And it's a great pleasure to have him here, have him speak to us tonight on the life and work of Charles Heath. Please welcome David Nichols.
Justin, thank you everybody for being here this evening to hear about this extremely interesting man, somewhat unsung, I would say, not just in the history of this particular area, the current city of Moreland, but also in Australian planning and architecture in the early 20th century in particular. So, Heath's Hats is a soon-to-be-published biography come memoir by Blythe Johnson. It's a study of Blythe's grandfather, Charles Heath. Blythe has the upper hand over me because he not only was in possession of most of the same material that I've used for this talk. It's now part of the Blythe and Josephine Johnson collection at the State Library of Victoria, along with material by Charles' son Frank and by Blythe and Josephine themselves. But he also knew Charles personally until Charles' death 70 years and I think 4 days ago. So I bring some interpretation, a little extra newspaper research, some field work, a different context from Blythe's intimate and professional one, but I'm very dependent on Blythe's work and I acknowledge that. Okay, it works. All right. How is local character created? Who contributes to local character? What individual elements might one person bring to a place to make it unique or at very least distinct? Also, how does local experience prepare someone for national impact? How are professionals impacted on by and how do they impact on the wider world? In the 1920s, Blythe Johnson tells us Charles Heath was periodically referred to in Coburg Council literature as the city architect. This wasn't his job or anyone's job, but as the designer of so many of the area's public buildings, including its widely celebrated town hall and the cemetery to its north, which, apart from anything else, provided the rationale for the railway line through Coburg, he was clearly a key figure in the city's development. He also made his mark elsewhere in the nation, a nation which he apparently never left, although he did read widely and broadly. Charles Robert Heath, seen here probably at the end of the 19th century when he was in his early 30s, was born on the 19th of December 1867 in Black Street, Ironbark, which is about 1.5 kilometres north of the centre of Sandhurst. His English parents were drapers and they moved to Melbourne soon after he was born. Blythe shows that their business switched from Collingwood to the city to Carlton in the 1880s, so they were around that general area. Charles was to be an only child. His parents was a little old for the time, so he just had it. Heath attended Melbourne Grammar from the age of 10 in 1877, then 2 years after that changed to Scotch College, which he left at the age of 14. Blythe surmises that Heath took drawing or drafting classes for some time in the next 3 years before he began an apprenticeship with George Jobbins at 22 Collins Street East, just prior to his 17th birthday. Jobbins' stock in trade as an architect was Banks, though this hotel had also been produced in his office when Heath was working there. At the same time, Heath helped to produce the plans for the Beechworth municipal offices. He actually won I guess it was a competition to design the municipal offices, but because he was still working with Jobbins, it ended up being a Jobbins artwork. But I think we can safely say that Heath was one of the main instigators there. Heath ended his indenture in late 1888 and stayed in employment with Jobbins for the next 4 years. And much later they would go into partnership. In a character reference for Heath, Jobbins wrote, "He is a good draftsman, a reliable surveyor and computer, and generally a first-class all-round man. In all pecuniary matters, his integrity is unquestionable." He entered practice with George Blackburn in 1892, which is a less than successful enterprise. Then he worked as a surveyor with Allen Newdell until 1895. He was clearly failing, however, to keep the wolf from the door in the face of the 1890s depression, which hit the eastern seaboard of Australia hard. In 1896, after 3 months spent in a hand-to-mouth existence in the bush, his parents paid for him to go to Western Australia, at that time a thriving part of the continent economically, in contrast to the east. The journey there by boat took about a week, and in early 1896, Heath began work on the Fremantle Harbour Works. After 5 months, he was compelled to resign due to the effect of the dazzling white sand at Fremantle. He was required to spend 3 months in a completely dark room, just having his meals delivered. And his vision was apparently always problematic after that time. You might remember from the first image, he's wearing very dark sunglasses, and it affected the rest of his life, for instance, his driving, so we're told by Blythe. Instead of Fremantle, he applied for and was granted the job as town surveyor and architect for the city of Geraldton. So he's moving from, well, here's Fremantle down here, and here's Geraldton up here. Actually, listen, oops, touch screen. He doesn't actually look that far, does it? But it's quite a distance. So here in Geraldton, Heath was finally to cut his teeth on a range of major projects which would be invaluable to him in his later career as experience. However, he was no doubt compelled to be a pragmatist and work within the presumably narrow requirements of the Geraldton Council's tastes and means. That's my interpretation. I don't think he was doing anything outrageous in Geraldton. He was certainly, he was making the people of Geraldton very satisfied with his efforts. He worked on a large range of projects, possibly also designed towns in the Murchison goldfields. That's a surmise that some people are making, and it's not necessarily, it's yet to be, any of those projects have yet to be found. So he produced designs for Geraldton's parks and esplanade and its municipal offices. You see the Geraldton Esplanade. Here you see its jetty in 1920, long after Heath was there. Heath sent for his fiancée, Margaret Kenny, and they were married in Geraldton at the end of that year, 1896. I found that looking through the Geraldton materials that you can get in Victoria, I think it's one of those things where if you turn up in a smallish city like Geraldton and you make your impact and you hang around partly to consolidate your reputation and to contribute overall, then you are remembered fondly and long in that place and commemorated and celebrated. In Geraldton's case, I get the strong sense that they don't really think much about Charles Heath anymore, even though he did make major contributions in the city around the turn of the last century. So they seem somewhat unaware of him. That's why I'm slightly hesitant to say that this is Heath's design for the municipal offices, although it seems to tally time-wise. The local paper at the time that the municipal offices were opened suggested that the one drawback of the building was that it was so comfortable that the councillors would spend too much time there. Why that was a problem, I'm not quite sure. But so it's a Victorian neoclassical municipal council building. Certainly, I would say that there's many like it around the nation still today. I'm sorry to say I don't know the status of it now, although looking at Geraldton's main street, looks like there's not too much intact from late 19th century building stock. In 1899, Heath became involved with the Geraldton Agricultural Society, and he designed its extensive showgrounds, and this was later to stand him in good stead with about 17 years later, in something like the competition that I'll talk about in a while. Heath's parents, in their 70s, relocated to Geraldton in 1898 and lived next door to their son, his wife, and by now 3 children. All 7 opted to return to Melbourne in early 1904, at which time Heath was presented with a purse of gold sovereigns by a grateful Geraldton populace. Blythe writes, after 8 years in Western Australia, Heath left with a wealth of experience in administration, financial management, architecture, surveying, engineering, planning, landscape design, handling difficult councillors and angry residents, and with the responsibility of a home and family. So Blythe suggests that Heath is returning to Melbourne in 1904 on the advice of his former mentor, George Jobbins, and the two struck a new partnership, Jobbins and Heath, architects and surveyors. So 1896, when Heath moved to Western Australia, was one turning point. We have the near blindness, the second relocation from Fremantle to Geraldton, and the marriage to Margaret. 1905 was to be at least as formative when he applied for another job, that of surveyor and secretary for a much-needed new cemetery in the northern suburb of Fawkner. He outlined his career and included in his application some plans suggestive of how this estate might be laid out for the purposes of a cemetery. The envelope, the application to work at Fawkner was sent on the day that applications closed. This is the house, I gather, that Heath and his family were living in Garden Street, North Carlton. It's 3 doors down from the Melbourne General Cemetery, so he might have had, presumably that's a coincidence, but he would have had some idea of what to do and maybe even what not to do in a cemetery. Melbourne General Cemetery and a number of much smaller local cemeteries were in existence at this time. Springvale was shortly to come into being. Metropolitan cemeteries were one of the first steps in metropolitan planning, representing an early foray into citywide planning. Fawkner was in some part located where it was to provide a rationale for the railway line. The railway line had been built in the, I'm not quite sure when, the 1880s, I think, and then it had been closed during the Depression, and then it was reopened in large part to service this new cemetery. It's now, of course, known as the Upfield Line, so it goes beyond the cemetery. Blythe claims that Heath's combined experiences, surveying, roads, drainage, landscaping and management, were significant, and being an architect was a bonus. Most of his competitors had some of these in their skill set, but none had all. He was one of the youngest applicants, I think the third youngest, and also had friends in high places, including Melbourne's Lord Mayor, Stephen Morrell, who was on the hiring committee. Handy. Of course, because why else would I be talking about it, he got the job. It seems unlikely that this is the actual plan for the cemetery that he sent with his application. It's definitely an early iteration. If you're familiar with the cemetery, you will notice that it is quite different, but the central so-called spider's web is the key feature that remains in all versions. So this main element, the fan or the spider web, 7 straight and 4 concentric avenues, was a clear and pragmatic approach to the problem presented by a long block of land with 1 railway station access and entranceway a third of the way along the eastern boundary, with 2 creeks that required crossings. Heath designed 3 concrete bridges for those crossings at strategic points, but these creeks were necessarily retained for landscaping purposes. I'll get to the cemetery proper in a second, but I'll just, one of these, these are the bridges that cross the creek, and this one I'm fairly certain is an original. There's another one which is a very recent, I think 2015 replica, and another one I'm not entirely 100% sure about. But back to the plan, which is one of the most interesting things I would say that Heath did. It gives us, this particular plan gives us a better sense of what was eventually laid out on the ground, although this is still not entirely what we see today. 2 of the diagonal roads were extended into further concentric endpoints, giving the possibility of scenic markers, and I'll talk about one of those shortly. The northern end of the space devolved into a park-like garden, which Heath wrote would be a relief to the more formal work of the other portions. The avenues were originally named for trees, maple, oak, poplar, etc. It was soon decided to number them instead. A very modern thing to do. The tree naming may have been considered incongruous, given that Heath favoured Indigenous plantings. In the preparation of what was only ever unofficially termed New Melbourne General Cemetery, Heath designed and moved his family into a house on the cemetery grounds, which was completed in 1907. Not too many pictures of the house, but you see it here on the far right. It's really, someone's really taken a picture of a road there, but the house happens to sneak in. Blythe says the office facing south across the entrance road would be the cemetery's administration centre for the next 30 years, and Heath and his family lived there until 1922. From the office, Heath could see funeral processions approaching without being too conspicuous, and it also provided plenty of light for working on the drawing board. I believe in this picture we can also see two outbuildings on the far left, a coach house and a stable, and an earth closet from the north boundary. I guess all burials are sad. The first burial at Faulkner was a particularly sad one. A 4-year-old girl called Doris Knapp. 1st of December 1906. Within the next 10 years, there came to be 8 men employed at the cemetery, either as grave diggers or maintenance workers or both. Some of the early buildings that Heath contributed to the cemetery, in addition to the house and office. I love this one, the Mohammedan chapel. Apparently, and this is something that Blythe mentions, and not entirely sure how this worked, but this is not the first Mohammedan chapel. So there was one that was demolished, and then this one was built, but obviously very early in the piece. This is a 1920s picture, according to Don Chambers, who wrote the history of the Faulkner Cemetery. Heath here tries to reference some visual element of the culture that he's designing for. I mean, ultimately, he's really just constructing a brick hut with this particularly ornate doorway. It's still there. Well, it was there yesterday when I photographed it. It now has a large crack for a conversation piece in the side. Inside there's a couple of benches and there's nothing more. Nevertheless, an early example of Heath, trying to acknowledge to some extent the different cultures within the cemetery and religions. This is what is known as the Jewish chapel at Faulkner. It's at least 100 years old. It may be 100 years old this year. This photograph is from 1918, and this is it yesterday. The Star of David there is original. It's there in the original photograph, but someone has painted it light blue. And we suspect these LED lights, of which 3 exist, the third one is a bit of wire pasted over the window, are likely to be original. One more major building that still exists at the cemetery site, designed by Heath, 90 years old, is the tea room and the flower store building. So visiting the cemetery, I think Heath makes this very clear in the kinds of things that we assume he is writing about in cemetery literature. That would, I imagine, would be part of his job as the secretary of the effectively running the cemetery day to day, as well as designing elements for it and doing the landscaping work and introducing new features and so on. One of the major ideas behind the cemetery was it was to be an experience, and it wasn't just an experience of grief, but as kind of a philosophical and a restorative and perhaps even a peaceful experience to visit there. And the rhetoric of you'll see a little bit of the rhetoric in some of the captions in the images to come, but I think give you that sense of what's trying to be put forward. So this 90-year-old building, which as you can see here from the Herald, 8th of February 1928, is largely intact, and it seems to be reasonably, it's quite a simple building, it seems to be reasonably intact inside as well, and it adjoins gardens that were laid out by Heath, of which you see here a wall which shows some of the same archways that kind of link it visually to the tea room windows. Okay. One of the most controversial and innovative elements of the Faulkner development was the inclusion of a crematorium. And this, like all good planning and architectural projects, involved science and promotion, maybe a little more of both than many other comparable enterprises. The crematorium process had to be perfected and needed to be efficient and proven, because there was a lot of ambivalence towards crematoria at this time. And the crematorium itself at Faulkner needed to be sold, so to speak, as a building, its placement configured sensitively. It had to be a classic example of utility, and Heath managed this with aplomb. There was one crematorium in Australia before this time, 1903, the Adelaide crematorium. There was a slow uptake with this, I guess, technology. The process apparently was being, you see in this headline, designed on American lines, the process apparently, and I'm sorry, I'm not up on the process, please don't ask me technical questions about crematoria, I don't know a huge amount. But the American lines, I gather, is kind of the technology involved, not the actual building, which, as you can see, is a Greek revival, really. Although, to my mind, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like there's something slightly Oriental about it as well, which, if I'm correct, is a little unusual. Am I getting it correct? So, blithe muses that progressive cremation advocates who'd supported his passion for cremation might have lent towards Greek rather than Gothic in their aesthetic direction. Gothic architecture, of course, was often associated with Christianity, and this isn't quite pagan, but it goes back to an earlier civilization, but it's still a civilization. Heath, perhaps even more importantly than the building is pretty attractive, but Heath argued for its prominent position in the cemetery at the main avenue's endpoint. Heath's into endpoints. Endpoints are a thing of 19th and early 20th century town planning. And there's often in the City Beautiful aesthetic, there's often an idea of looking a long way down a beautiful avenue to see something delightful at the end. In this instance, the delightful thing was the crematorium. So cremation shifted from a minimal presence in the funeral and cemetery trade in the early 1930s to account for 1/5 of disposals in the mid-1940s. In 1934, Heath also designed the Brisbane crematorium. So he became, to a limited degree, he became Mr. Crematorium. That's a nicer picture of the building with the original caption there, which I've retyped from the promotional booklet, Cremation at Faulkner, which I'm putting at possibly late 1930s, although that's a little bit of a guess. Sadly, this building was demolished in 1980, and it was replaced with something far less ostentatious and quite a loss, I think, to the cemetery. Some of the images from within here in the small chapel. You probably can't, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a mural which is often credited to Napier Waller, but Blythe says it's by Napier Waller's wife, Christian Waller. I'm on the fence about that, but this is the kind of aesthetic that we're seeing here. An atmosphere of dignity and colourful simplicity permeates the principal chapel at Faulkner. Okay, so by the 20s and 30s, let's say by the 30s, Heath has a salary to run the cemetery. He's relatively comfortable, and he has an increasingly large family. I think he ends up with, I could be wrong, but I think 5 children. Some of whose descendants, by the way, are here with us today. And he is So he's not doing badly, I think we can safely say. He has, not only does he have a wage and accommodation for which he pays a reasonably small rent, he also, at least that's true until 1922, and he moves out of the cemetery grounds, and he has a reasonable amount of time on his hands and an increasing reputation. He quite possibly, and this is Blythe's surmise once again, had nothing to do once the cemetery was up and running for extended periods of time. So the 1910s and 20s in particular see him undertake a large range of projects, competitions and commissions. One is a rather beautiful creation, and it seems to me to be quite like Charles Heath to take this on. He enters the competition to design the federal capital. Oops, sorry, I missed the design that he put together for a very ornate entranceway to the Faulkner Cemetery, but that never came to be. What I really want to talk about, because I'm jumping through this, is the Canberra competition. Made him, all due respect, it made him a footnote in the world's most celebrated and controversial city building enterprise of the early 20th century. He submitted this very functional, quite rational, best practice city plan to the Canberra competition. I'm assuming everybody, maybe I should. The Canberra competition was launched by the federal government in 1912. It was not then known as the Canberra competition because nobody knew the name of the city that they were designing for as the federal capital competition. And it was open to people around the world, but quite a few architects and declined to enter, and quite a few architectural bodies, professional bodies, encouraged their members to boycott the competition because it was not going to be judged by professional architects. It was going to be judged by politicians. And I think that in the final analysis, even though I think many would be fairly happy with the design that actually did win, that did prove to be extremely problematic in the longer term. So Heath did not win, although he had a theory which was conveyed to Blythe through Heath's son Frank, that he certainly came a lot closer to winning than it appeared. He wasn't a runner-up, but there was some measure of conspiracy theory that Charles was privy to. Someone told him that he came very close and he was robbed in some way. His plan is commended by the author of Canberra 1912, the American planning historian John Reps, and it does contain many best practice features of the period. One I like in particular, which is just a random grab out of many fine features, is the islands as refuge for lake fowl. So he has this idea that, like the winning competition entry, he recommends damming the Molonglo River and making a lake, and he identifies the bits that would still be sticking up at the top, and he wants them to be a kind of, not quite nature reserves, I suppose, but I'm sure he has visions of ducks and other birds rising from the lake early in the morning. And I don't know how well you can see that really. It's a site-sensitive, spacious plan. It's packed with features. The one thing that is conspicuously missing is the cemetery. There is no cemetery in Heath's federal capital. Now, he also provided, and this harks back a little bit to his ornate gateway to the cemetery, he provided designs such as this one to newspapers and possibly to the appropriate civic bodies, presumably to either inspire government into action or, if nothing else, serving to publicise his business and his abilities. RAIA architects were forbidden to advertise. So this was I'm sorry it's not a better image. This came from a newspaper, and it's really just as you can see, it's It's a little newsprint illustration. I put a picture of the actual location, the intended location below. I'm really not sure how much you can see, but this is Sydney Road, this is Elizabeth Street, this is Pelham Street, this is, completely forgotten the name of this road, and he's suggesting that where the Haymarket, that unbelievably difficult roundabout at Haymarket, he's proposing that be a large open square, treed, these important buildings at either end, fountains and a bridge, and on top of the, sorry, not a bridge, a kind of an ornamental gateway, and on top of the ornamental gateway, he wants to put a statue indicating the triumphal progress of the City of Melbourne, featuring an old bullock dray to revive memories of old times on an historic road. He claimed this would transform North Melbourne when it was thrown across the top end of Elizabeth Street. Flemington Road is the name of the road. And there would also be formal gardens, shrubberies, squares and flower beds, which would incorporate in part beautiful gardens and private residences and alluring walks leading off into Princes Park and the university grounds. So in some senses, this is 1914, he's predicting Royal Parade. In other senses, he's proposing something much, much more grand than what we have, and certainly probably difficult to perambulate around in peak hour traffic, but much more pleasant in all other ways than what we have now. That's just my opinion. If anyone wants to argue that, I don't know. So he entered some other competitions, much smaller than Canberra, but still bringing him some fame and respect. One important one was the Adelaide Showgrounds competition. Heath won a £300 prize for this, very comprehensive. The most complete and up-to-date agricultural showground in the world, according to perhaps not the most authoritative source, the Brunswick and Coburg Star, but someone was saying it. In the Royal Agricultural Society of South Australia, were happy to award Heath the prize, but they weren't so happy when he insisted that he should be allowed to then come and supervise the construction of his plan, and they ended up not letting that happen at all, and very little was built of the actual plan. Much more locally, and I don't have an illustration of this, he won a competition in Essendon for a design for a grandstand in what I assume is Windy Hill. He was to be awarded £25 for this, and the following year he's suing Essendon Council, claiming that prize, plus £64 for the preparation of the specs, the same amount for breach of agreement. All in all, he's claiming £153, and the council claimed that Heath's design was too expensive and that he didn't deserve to win the prize in the first place. The judge agreed, and so he didn't get anything. But, you win some, you lose some. That's worse things could happen. Within a decade, he produces probably his most famous enterprise, opened in October 1923, and that is, of course, the Coburg Town Hall, which is, I think we can safely say, a popular and successful building still in use today. This is it yesterday. Blythe says that Heath takes the traditional dome and colonnade of civic buildings but uses them in a novel way. He gives them an intimate human scale and creates a friendly, approachable building rather than an awesome one. This is, of course, entirely true, and it is quite a remarkable building, one that, because of its position on Bell Street, I think, thousands and thousands of people drive past it every day and barely give it a look, but it definitely works. One of the things that I think is important to think about with the Coburg Town Hall, and its wide, low, not that low, but wide, quite impressive frontage onto Bell Street, is it covers up Pentridge Prison, which is behind it. Without the town hall, you could just see a prison, and that is, of course, was until very recently a kind of a badge of shame, I think, for the city of Coburg for a very long time. Of course, Coburg was originally known as Pentridge. They changed the name to Coburg. That got them into trouble because Coburg is, of course, a German name, but they weathered that one, and it's all fine now. Coburg Town Hall was one of Heath's biggest and most important undertakings as an architect, and it was effectively realised to his designs down to small details, it would appear. There's all of these little elements that he has included in the plans, and they're very extensive plans. And he is also even designing the furniture and so on. He returned to the building on occasion, reconfiguring the hall, for instance, as a cinema in, I think, the late 20s. And he continues to be recognised as that continues to be recognised as one of his most important creations, and a major creation. Remember, he's already done Beechworth, probably in the late 19th century. He's done the municipal offices for Geraldton, and he also worked in tandem with another architect on a redesign for Brunswick Town Hall too. So he has a few town halls under his belt. This is not the only thing that Heath did, though. It wasn't just these kinds of civic buildings or cemeteries or showgrounds. He was also about houses. Heath himself and his family moved to 48 The Grove, Coburg in 1922, a house which he designed but which no longer stands. 44 Glencairn Avenue is one of the 3 known extant Heath houses, according to Blythe. So this is 44. The designs of 44 exist, as you can see, and this was a house designed for one of Heath's children, Bessie, and her new husband, Burton Blythe Johnson. So this was designed in 1924, and this was the house in which Blythe lived for the first 18 years of his life. This was his parents' marital home. It was named Banul, which apparently is an Aboriginal word for hill, and Blythe regularly polished their brass plate with the name on it with brasso, which he says was very satisfying. In early 1926, Margaret Heath died unexpectedly. Blythe puzzles over what his grandmother might have been like and can only rely on small details. For instance, Frank's memory that she teased Charles awfully, though in a friendly manner. This is what's wonderful about Blythe's book, is that it's a well-researched biography, and he leaves no stone unturned in his exploration of this man's work. But then he colours it not only with his own memories and the memories that things that other people have told him who knew Charles, but also with the parallels between Charles's career and Blythe's own career with his wife Josephine. So it is extremely rich in that sense as a resource. It's a great read too, and I believe it's going to be published even this year. So 1926, Heath is widowed, but this year was nonetheless as productive as all of Heath's 1920s as he prepared to enter his 60s. This building, not a fabulous visual. This building would have been well underway at the time of Margaret's death. One interesting thing to me about this particular drawing, I haven't quite compared it to reality, but it seems to me that it's been created to make the building look like it stands alone, whereas in fact it sits between 2 much older bluestone buildings. This is the Coburg Parish Hall in Sydney Road, very close to Bell Street, virtually on an adjoining block to the Town Hall. So there's an 1859 schoolhouse on the other side, here on the left-hand side, which And possibly there was an expectation that that would be demolished. It's still there. And this is the building recently. Many other church buildings come out of the Charles Heath's office. I'm choosing to focus on one important one. It's important in a number of ways, and it's sort of transitional, I think, for Charles Heath too, and his legacy. So this is the original plan, the original design for St Linus's Church in Mellinston. Blythe says that this is Frank Heath's first work. So Frank opts to become an architect as well, following the footsteps of his father, and receives his architecture degree in 1932. You see Charles, I don't know if you can see, but Charles has signed the drawing, and Blythe suggests that maybe Frank has coloured the drawing and possibly done some of the minor work on the overall. Now, arguably, I guess it depends where you're coming from, but arguably Frank went on to even greater prominence than his father. He learned not only architectural skills, but also skills of advocacy. But also, I suppose, the channels were much more available in the mid-20th century than they had been to Charles in the early 20th century. Frank was best known as a planner, but his office would nevertheless complete numerous designs for hospitals, banks and similar public buildings until the 1960s. Blythe Johnson worked for and with Frank for a number of years, but ultimately declined to take over the Frank Heath business. But the Blythe and Josephine Johnson collection, which I think I mentioned earlier, contains material from Charles, from Frank and from Blythe and Josephine. So look at this bit, and then look at what exists. So it's only a portion of what was designed, and this was the first bit built, and then it came to be appreciated that there wasn't going to be enough money to build the full thing. But it's actually a pretty beautiful church, and whether you do or don't like churches, I would advise you go and visit it. It's actually quite a great place. In fact, you get the opportunity on the 18th of August, a local ensemble, the Linus Ensemble, are playing there at 5 p.m. 5 p.m. on Saturday, 18th of August. So you could go and listen to them and see the church. And it has these kinds of simple, stripped back in lots of ways, somewhat modern, a good blend of modern and traditional. In the Charles Heath's drawings, there are some of these, in some ways quite simple but quite striking windows, and I suspect they may be Frank's design, working with his father just as he comes into his own as an architect. And I advise you to keep your eye on that one on the left, because that's what we see replicated quite a bit in the actual church today. So Heath is actually extremely active. Charles Heath is actually extremely active in the 1920s and 30s. He is creating many houses, many shops, churches, church buildings. He is active in the church itself. So he has that network, and he is quite productive. He's actively engaged in pursuing and often completing commissions for around what is now the Moreland area. Heath's notebooks, according to Blythe, were filled with notes on the remodelling of the Edinburgh Castle Hotel, for instance. And this was indeed more attention than he gave to any other building, according to Blythe. There's no evidence that he actually did any work on this structure. So I guess that's the lot of the architect, I suspect, now as it was then. You spend a lot of time on certain projects that come to nothing, and sometimes things do come to something. 357 Sydney Road was another of Heath's works in the 1920s. The ground level, as you can see, has been completely remade. I never noticed this building until I went looking for it, because of course if you walk up there, all you see is these shops. but above is, I had a feeling whether they are apartments now, they may not be. I suspect that that's what they were designed to be, like live-in shops, with that nice little open area there and an archway as well. It's one of the few commercial buildings of Heath's that's still standing. At the same time I went out looking for this, I also went out looking for something that Blythe said was an even better example of Heath's commercial work on the corner of Union and Grantham, and that's not there anymore. So Charles Heath is moving towards retirement, and he buys a house in Eltham in 1937 called Gaybrook, which Blythe describes as a simple asbestos cement sheet boiler house without a pedigree. He lived alone. A lot of family came to visit him. He had quite a big family. Blythe has some great stories in the book about going to spend time, spend the weekend or whatever or holidays with his grandfather. But he essentially lived alone. He had some home help, which was not easy to get at that time. He didn't have any electricity or gas, however. He was the secretary and the surveyor to the cemetery until 1945, when Frank took over. And he broke his hip at the age of 80, at which time he left Laughing Waters Road in Gaybrook, and he relocated to his earlier house, 48 The Grove, and he died on the 4th of August 1948 and was cremated 2 days later. So it's actually 5 days and 70 years ago. His ashes were placed in compartment B/114 at the Falkner Cemetery. So 4 years after Charles's death, Frank designs this creation in commemoration of his father. This was opened on the 19th of March 1952. It was, so it's once again, it's in the Don Chambers book, which is, for a book that came out 14, 15 years ago, is stunningly difficult to get a hold of these days. I remember it coming out, I wish I had bought a copy. The fountain proved to be a nuisance. When the winds came up, it blew water over people walking by, including funeral processions. So it was decided that there had to be some alterations done to it. And this is the fountain as it currently exists. A hodgepodge with 2 alterations made firstly to the way that the jets are directed into the central bowl, and then also the way that the water comes down from the top of these mushroom, solar mushroom. The fountain is a hodgepodge which Blythe says does little to honour Heath, who set such high standards of design at Falkner in his 40 years as planner, architect, landscape architect and manager. There's the dedication plaque. Interestingly, doesn't name Frank Heath as the designer of the fountain, which is probably fair, since the fountain that Frank designed was only a portion of what's there, and doesn't say when it was dedicated. So, in conclusion, Heath is something of a cipher. He was not one to write justifications or overviews of his intentions. He did not appear to be much of a joiner. He joined the Geraldton Agricultural Society, and he was a mason, but not joining major public bodies to be an advocate or anything like that. Whereas Frank, I think, really saw ways to work in publicity, not simply to his own advantage, but to the greater advantage of things that he believed in. So, back to Charles was not really a campaigner on anything, with the possible exception of the best practice example of the New Melbourne General Cemetery at Falkner. There are some things, nonetheless, that I think we can say about his legacy and his importance. He's an all-rounder with a holistic sense of community-based and community-serving the urban environment. He has strong aesthetic senses, which are often of their time, but he also produces pragmatically well-made and fit-for-purpose buildings and even places. He is an advocate to a certain degree, largely in examples, for scientific solutions, and he's committed to crashing through on matters that he believed in. And he's also the founder of a virtual architecture/planning dynasty through his son Frank, his nephew Blythe, and Blythe and Josephine Johnson's children who are working in related disciplines. Blythe makes the point numerous times in Heath's Hats that the longer a practitioner has to work on a problem, the better the result. Charles Heath had close to 40 years to work on Faulkner, enough to ensure not only best practice in the layout and execution of the cemetery, but also to make its ambience and its values greater than the sum of its parts. So many of his buildings there have been demolished, and I think at the time they were somewhat unmourned. However, the Faulkner Memorial Park, as it is now known, is testament to his capacities and his values. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions not about cremation, then I'm happy to.
You use the word utility. Is that a mixture of beautiful and utility?
That's it. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's
Never heard that term. It's a good one.
Well, it's a word. It's a real word. Spell checker didn't give me a red squiggly line on that one.
Yeah. Also, that building in Sydney Road, the apartment looking one.
Yeah.
The top of it looks slightly unresolved, whereas the other work all seems quite resolved. Is that perhaps not the complete facade?
It may be. And you know what, though, if we're talking about, I think that's the building behind. I can't tell you. As I say, there aren't the plans for this don't exist in the State Library collection. So we know that he did it, but we don't know much more about that. And I see what you mean. There may well have been something more to that, but my guess is as good as yours. Also.
This is the dome, isn't it? The town hall.
Yeah, in some ways it is. It's true. Yeah.
Do you know how the book will be published? Who will publish it and when?
Sorry, I thought you might know better than me. I gather it's I've had some discussion with Josephine about this,
Yes.
and I'm of the opinion that it is a publishable book in the sense of it has some wider appeal rather than just a private privately published or self-published, so to speak, piece of work. I think, as I said, it has that great perspective from someone who knew the man, but who is also taking a step back and researching. So I asked Josephine earlier in the week if she would object to me taking it to a publisher. I had one in mind, but that's in some ways I don't necessarily want to get involved. If the family wants to publish it themselves, I think they should.
Okay.
And maybe there's someone here who knows something more about that. Okay. Yeah. I gather from Joe that it's a fairly it may happen quite soon. Sorry, did you have?
I'd just like to add that he was a member of the North Suburban Lodge and led that lodge. Was a Freemason.
A Mason, yes. Okay, that's right. He was a keen Mason. That's true. And he designed some Masonic buildings as well. I haven't included here, but yeah, very true. Thank you.
The building on the corner of Union and Frankfurt might be viewable in Street View.
Good
in
point.
Google.
Look.
It should go back to about 2007.
Yes.
They're good quality.
Look, I think you may well be right. It may be viewable. I should have thought of that. We also, where I work, we have access to the MF, which is in some ways could be a useful tool in that regard as well. But yeah, good point. Thank you. Nevertheless, I feel so happy that I've satisfied everybody's curiosity. This topic.
You didn't mention that he was a good pipe smoker.
You're right, and that is part of Blythe's story. That's right. He's also Blythe has a story about him almost setting fire to his Eltham property from not noticing that something had fallen on the ground. Yeah, that's true. Pipe smoke.
Did you have a look at the other residences that he built? Was there 3, did you say, or 2?
I didn't visit them. I didn't visit any residences in the course of this research.
Addresses?
I have them. Yes, they're in the book. So I gather that it gets a bit depressing when you start to read through Blythe's text about. Obviously, Blythe went and visited as many as possible and found a lot of them had been demolished. He often found out when they'd been demolished too. Some very grand residences in Sydney Road, I gather, and I want to say Dr. Miller, who had a surgery in a house in what looked like an extremely noble house that Blythe says is now a car yard. But so there's, I think the houses in particular is a bit of a sad story.
You're suggesting that he's somewhat uncelebrated. Can you give us some context in terms of the other Heaths that might have been around Melbourne or the rest of the country? Some context in terms of architecture as a practice back then, and was there 1 or 2 celebrated architects that everybody knew and there are a bunch of Heaths, or was it a fairly select group anyway, and architecture wasn't particularly thought about by the wider populace?
That's a terrific question, and I think that that's something I'd have to give some more thought to. When about 10 years ago I co-edited a book with my colleague Hannah Louis about community buildings. It's called Community, and we looked a lot at the phenomenon of the city engineer who would turn his hand to architecture, and I'm trying really hard to remember the name of the man in the queue, and I can't. But there is, for instance, a great example who I feel like sits to a certain degree in the same kind of category. A gentleman who you could sort of imagine them saying he's employed by the City of Kew for 50 years, and they say to him, every few years someone says, "Can you come over and design a kindergarten or design?" So he's and he produces some amazing work, some really beautiful, quite in some ways quite humble, but always seemingly to me appropriate places, often kindergartens. It strikes me that there are these people who are practitioners who are to a certain degree. I don't think Heath is quite under the radar. I mean, I think he has an occasional prominence. You have to wonder. It's one of those you never know kind of scenarios. If he didn't have the comfortable job of 40 years working at the cemetery, if he had to go out and
compete for his work,
exactly,
and sell himself as he did in parts.
Periodically he would, and So I'm not sure, but that's a really good point. I think there are often small, low-key architects who do produce some rather remarkable buildings very locally in all cities of Australia, particularly in the early 20th century. They do often fly under the radar a little bit, and Heath is kind of different in that sense, in that he does something in Brisbane, he does something in Adelaide, he wins a competition in Adelaide, and he does seem to dominate in Geraldton in the late 19th, early 20th century for some period of time. So in that sense, I think he's a bit unique. In other senses, he's a jobbing architect who does what's required of him. Presumably, the client knows best in most cases.
Perhaps his wife helped him. She was the daughter of an Irish builder.
That's true. We don't, as I said, we don't know much about Margaret, except that she teased him in fun. I don't know if that's helpful.
Her to Geraldton to marry him. So the wedding was held in Geraldton, and the first 2 people were born in Geraldton.
Yes, I know. I said 3 children when I was speaking, and as I was saying that, I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, that's 3 children in 2 years. That's not impossible. That's it could have been twins, but anyway.
Yeah.
You mentioned that he never left Australia, but there seems to be sort of exotic elements to some of the buildings, like the crematorium, the Coburg Town, and even that sort of impediment that we've got going on here. Where do you think that sort of crept in?
This is a great question. This is why I think he's, I'm assuming he reads a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that he kind of keeps an eye out on what other people are doing. I don't know. He doesn't, and I guess I don't know for a fact that he didn't leave Australia, but I don't see any evidence that he did. But I'm sure you could find a lot of inspiration in trade magazines and so on. That's all I know. Yeah. It's a good question. It's worth investigation.
I think we're done. All right. So thank you very much, David. It was a very informative talk. Thank you, everybody, for attending. 10 past 8. Please feel free for 20 minutes or so, come and get a cup of tea or a coffee, have a chat with David. Tim Tam's always good, probably maybe a bit late for some of us, but never mind. So please, thank you all for coming. Please fill in the feedback forms. That'd be much appreciated. And thanks once again, David.